Really?
Do we know where Nick is? Yes, he's powdering his nose. I'm gonna borrow 5 minutes. And that way we won't, oh, there he is, great. I thought that the bandits had come and gotten you. I'm gonna borrow a few minutes of downtime. We are due to go online in about 3 minutes. I want to take a moment to introduce our friend and schoolmate. Nick just completed his doctoral, his PhD at Yale in East Asian Studies at the East Asian Department. And he was focused on a very interesting period and topic. It was what is often referred to as the Southern Ming. And the Southern Ming is a period where Beijing was overthrown, Nanjing was overthrown, and for 18 years, there were young children emperors that were on the run. And he was focused on how the struggling on the road in flight dynasty got its message out. They didn't have internet. Okay, so they were using wood-block prints, and obviously a territory in crisis, in collapse. How do you get the message out to the people and your soldiers in the outside world? And in Ukraine, they're facing this issue. And I'm not saying anything about Taiwan in particular here. Nick is currently a resident fellow at the law school at Yale in an information society project. He's also focused on media research. It's an issue that's very important, obviously, to Taiwan. He's widely published in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Foreign Affairs, and the New Yorker. On your table is one of the New Yorker articles about Jin Yong. And he has very impressive list of scholarships and fellowships, including the Fulbright. He was a Fulbright fellow in Beijing. He was a visiting fellow at Hong Kong U, and also at Columbia Journalism School, and the Blakemore Fellow in Taiwan here. He spent time at both Sida and Taida. So I want to spend 2 minutes and bring us back to the Song Dynasty. Most of us have almost no understanding of what that means. Probably Suchi over here knows. He's also a Southern Song and Southern Ming kind of guy. Let me try to give you a feel. It's a dynasty, so there's an emperor, but the Song are very different. At the end, so the Song Dynasty was 960 to 1279, not counting the Southern Song. And the emperor became a figurehead. The cabinet told the emperor that the world belongs to our nation, to our ancestors, to the government, the people, and the military. It does not belong to you. And the emperor had to say, I would not dare to disagree with you. Sounds a little bit like Taiwan. It's an emperor, not an empress. The Song had implemented universal education, public clinics, welfare, retirement homes, and burial rights for the poor. Private investors had formed investment clubs to sponsor overseas trade of things like paper, silk, porcelain, things that only the Song had and nobody else had. International trade, this was a naval power, and they were trading all the way to Southern Europe. Scientifically, the Song mathematicians had started using negative numbers in quadratic equations and provided solutions to polynomial equations 600 years before Europe. Some of us remember what that is, right? We're Asian, we're good at math. there was a huge emphasis on education, and the invention of printing press produced close to 500,000 educated youth attending the national exam a year. This educated class of students and scholars, the largest in the world, became a driving force for science, engineering, agricultural genetics, forensic science, literature, and art. Compared to Europe, the University of Paris was only established in 1150 with a handful of students. Without the Mongol invasion, it's conceivable that the Song would have experienced the Industrial Revolution first before Europe. The Mongol invasion basically reset the society back to a feudal system of master-slave. In Sichuan province, where the Song people resisted the Mongols to the end, less than 2.4% of the population survived. It was a brutal, brutal invasion. Buddhism was expanding from India from before 1000, and Hangzhou was a learning center and a center for Zen and San, which covered the world, Japan, Korea, many other places. Without further ado, I hope you have a feel for the song. I want to introduce my schoolmate, a Southern Song guy. Here's Nick Frisch. I'm gonna let you turn this Zoom on for everyone. We are being joined by clubs around Asia.
Thank you. I think you can all hear me like this, right? Yeah, is that good? Okay. We'll save this for Q&A. And if we could,
Can they hear you on the Zoom?
they can hear me. We have a mic here. And if we could dim the lights just a little bit, I'm gonna show you some images. And while we're waiting for that, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who made this event possible. At the Yale Club, the other clubs, at the American Club, Maria, Jerry, Natalie, Sherman, everyone at Pamir, Nick and Jean. It's a pleasure to be back in Taipei after a too long absence. And I'm glad to be able to share with you today the story of Jin Yong and the history behind it. When Louis Cha passed away in a Hong Kong hospital in October of 2018 at the age of 94, condolences came from a remarkable range of prominent people who were fans of the Kung Fu novels he wrote under the pen name of Jin Yong. William Lai of Taiwan, Xi Jinping and the Central People's Government in Beijing, Jack Ma, previously of Alibaba, who based his corporate culture on Jin Yong novels. Jet Li, the martial artist who launched his film career playing Jin Yong characters. Margaret an opposition politician in Hong Kong, who was recently arrested. Regina Ip, a more pro-Beijing politician in Hong Kong. And many, many more. And it's hard to think of another figure in contemporary Chinese language Sinophone culture who could attract such a wide range of fans. They all found something that resonated in Jin Yong's stories. And the reasons for that are rooted in Louis Cha's own life story. Cha's family clan, the Cha lineage, lived for generations in the prosperous Yangtze River Delta surrounding modern-day Shanghai, in a small town on the Qiantang River, close to the famous West Lake in Hangzhou. This is a region that is rich in history and has a long lineage of heroes. One of the most famous heroes is Yue Fei, the heroic martyr general. As Nick was saying, in the 12th century, nomadic tribes on horseback attacked China's Song Dynasty from the north in a cataclysmic invasion that ended with the rise of Genghis Khan and the Mongol conquest of all China. During the retreat, the imperial court fled south and settled on the shores of the West Lake, founding the Southern Song. And Yue Fei, a soldier native to the north, came south with them. He urged the court to fight back against the invaders rather than appease them. And he coined one of his personal four-character mottos, "Return my rivers and mountains," meaning return my native land to me, inscribed above his head here in his own calligraphy, here in the Yue Fei Temple near the shores of the West Lake. But Yue Fei was betrayed by a scheming minister in the imperial court, Qin Hui, sometimes pronounced Qin Kuai, who wanted to cut a deal with the nomad tribes and conspired to have Yue Fei executed. And ever since, the name of Qin Hui has been synonymous with treason, while the name of Yue Fei is synonymous with loyalty. And to this day, tourists visiting the West Lake spit on this statue of Qin Hui, and they leave offerings, which you can see in the photo, under the statue of the martyr general Yue Fei. Now, Louis Cha's family has a long history in this region, with generations of scholars and government officials living in this family compound. As is traditional in China, the sons of educated families take the imperial civil service exam and become ministers and serve the imperial throne, which Cha's ancestors did with great distinction. Their service was so cherished by one emperor, the Kangxi Emperor, that in the 17th century, Kangxi personally inscribed this lacquer tablet in his own hand, which now hangs in one of the halls of the family compound. And he also wrote a poetic couplet praising the Cha lineage as a great clan since the ancient times of the Tang and Song dynasties in the Jiangnan region, which has produced many wise men. But being close to the imperial throne has its risks as well. One of Cha's ancestors offended the following emperor when he used a poetic couplet, two characters of which closely resemble the emperor's name if you take their heads off. Now, this was interpreted by the emperor as evidence of sedition, which might seem like a bit of a stretch or a little silly in our modern day, but traditionally in Chinese culture, sometimes people do take this kind of thing quite seriously. And the offense provided a pretext to arrest Cha's ancestor, whose severed head was then displayed on a pike. Louis Cha was born in 1924. And as a child growing up, Cha had access to a vast family library accumulated over generations. He was immersed in classical historical texts, canons of poetry and philosophy and statecraft. And he also read traditional Chinese novels, many of which are embroidered history, weaving fictitious characters and plots into and out of real historical events. Picaresque epics like The Water Margin and Romance of the Three Kingdoms are full of wandering kung fu knights. And one concept that occurs again and again in these novels is xia, righteousness, seeking justice, but also often operating outside the state in the jianghu, literally the rivers and lakes, metaphorically a space outside the control of the imperial government, where, especially when that government is corrupt or tyrannical. One of the classical poems that Louis Cha read as a child, which explains this concept, uses the Xia character in its title. And we know that this is one of Jin Yong's favorite poems because he later titled one of his novels after it, using the same title. It's by the famous Song Dynasty poet Li Bai, Ballad of the Knight Errant, the Xia Ke. And the verse conjures up the idea of a righteous outlaw, a kind of kung fu Robin Hood figure. The knight errant Zhao's tasseled hat flutters. His curved blade gleams cold as frost. On a silver saddle, shining atop a white steed, blazing like a shooting star. He can kill a man every 10 paces, not stopping for 1,000 miles. When the righteous deeds are done, he straightens his clothes and steals away. Name unknown and person unseen. After 3 toasts of wine, he makes an oath of loyalty, his vow weightier than the 5 sacred peaks. When his eyes flare and his ears burn hot, his resolve scorches the sky, and so on. I think you get the idea of the Xia Ke. As a child, Louis Cha also read translated European novels. He loved the books of Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, and especially Alexandre Dumas, whose Three Musketeers was a special Cha favorite, and which was translated into Chinese using this Xia knight-errant word. Cha's education is interrupted by the Japanese invasion, which comes to his home region in 1937. Cha's mother dies while trying to escape Japanese bombing raids. And like the Mongols before them, Japanese troops rode their horses towards the West Lake, occupying one of the famous pagodas. Meanwhile, the UFA temple on the shores of the West Lake becomes a non-combatant sanctuary for what was then the Chinese equivalent of the Red Cross, the red Buddhist swastika. Separated from his family and fleeing his hometown, Louis Cha went towards the interior of China and ended up in Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist wartime capital of Chongqing, where, for lack of other options, he enrolls in a political military school run by Jiang's Nationalist Party. And at this time, the war is not going well. The Japanese are bombing Chongqing, and there are rumors in the nationalist government that under this ferocious pressure of the bombing campaign and the war, there might be some talk of suing for peace or even cutting a deal with the Japanese. And Cha hears about this rumor, according to the story, when his teacher, a nationalist officer at the school, makes a curious remark. And the teacher says, you know, UFA didn't understand practical politics, but Qin Hui knew how to get things done. And the teacher didn't need to say anything else in this context. What was being considered was clear. In the end, America joins the war, the Japanese are defeated, and Cha goes to Shanghai and starts his newspaper career with the well-regarded Da Gong Bao. Soon after, he goes to British colonial Hong Kong, just as Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government is losing the civil war to Mao Zedong's communists on the mainland. And while Cha is in Hong Kong, back home in the village near Hangzhou, after the communist victory, his father is declared a counter-revolutionary enemy of the people and dragged out in front of the clan compound and executed with the family forced to watch. Under the circumstances, Cha decides to remain in Hong Kong. He keeps working as a freelance journalist, and he writes some scripts for the film industry working with a famous actress at the time. You can see him there on the left. And then in 1954, Cha's life changes forever when the Kung Fu master Chen, a disciple of the Tibetan white crane Kung Fu style, challenges Master Wu of the Taiji Chuan style to a charity fundraiser Kung Fu battle royale in Macau. Now, this is an epic thriller in Manila, rumble in the jungle level media spectacle at the time. After the first punch is thrown, you can see the blood spattered on Master Chan's shirt there. And almost overnight, there is a craze for Kung Fu fiction serialized in Hong Kong's newspapers. Cha tries his hand at it, writing small installments every day, and he's an instant success. Readers love the cinematic narrative style influenced by movies and the adventures of Dumas, and they love his kaleidoscopic erudition in Chinese history and literature. For his pen name, Cha takes the last character of his proper name and he splits it in two to become Jin Yong. His real breakout hit in the Hong Kong Commercial Daily newspaper is Legend of the Condor Shooting Heroes, 射雕英雄传. And the story begins on a snowy night in the southern Song Dynasty, in a small village near Cha's hometown, not far from the West Lake, some years after the nomad invasion and occupation of the North. Two friends, refugees from the North living in the southern Song, encounter a mysterious stranger, a roving Taoist monk, in the snowy evening, and things escalate and they end up sparring. But the stranger monk has strong enough gong fu to block one of the men's distinctive spear fighting style, which is a deadly family secret passed down from his grandfather, who fought alongside the martyr general Yue Fei. With their patriotic and martial arts credentials established, the three band together and resolve to fight the nomad invaders. And this sets off a plot that lasts over generations and the three huge novels of the Condors trilogy. Part of the story is driven by the quest for a secret military manual written by the martyr general Yue Fei before his execution. This detail is fiction from Jin Yong's imagination. And the manual is supposedly hidden in a tomb near the West Lake. His success in writing fiction as Jin Yong positions Louis Cha, who is still working as a journalist, to start his own newspaper, Ming Pao, in 1959. And in the very first issue, he promises that the newspaper will seek impartiality, benevolence, vividness, and beauty. Also, in the first issue, he starts serializing the Condors sequel. The newspaper business is very precarious, then as now, and so the hope is that readers will come for the fiction and stay for the news. And on the front page of an early edition of Ming Pao, it says very prominently, "We are serializing Jin Yong's martial arts fiction." And indeed, he keeps churning out hit after hit, after hit, after hit, after hit. And I'm sure many of you have read many of these books. Some of you have your favorites, your favorite characters. And although there are many others writing martial arts fiction at this time, Cha is not only the most popular, but he also develops a reputation for having some really well-developed female characters with a lot of emotional complexity that is rare by the standards of the genre. You can see Huang Rong and Wu Nianzi fighting here for those of you who remember that episode. As he's writing in the newspaper, each day's installment will often end with a little cliffhanger, sometimes literally. so that readers will want to buy the following day's paper and figure out what happens next. And these novels become film and TV franchises that last for decades. I think there are 15 different adaptations of the Condors, starting from when Jin Yong was a relatively young man, as you can see, and they're still churning out versions of them today. The films are so popular and create so many memorable characters. You can see Jin Yong here standing with a large cast of, I think it's Shu Jian Enshou Lu, The Book and the Sword, that they enter everyday speech. Much as a Harry Potter fan might ask you, are you a Hufflepuff or a Slytherin? A Jin Yong fan might ask, are you a Yang Kang or are you a Guo Jing? Are you a Huang Rong? Are you a Xiaolong Yu? I've been told that people use these personality types when they're dating. And of course, the androgynous villain Dongfang Bubai has been claimed as a queer icon by the LGBTQ community in the Chinese-speaking world. The newspaper serials are quickly published into books and translated into other languages in the Asian cultural sphere. In the 60s and early 70s, after the books are translated into Vietnamese, as the anti-communist regime in South Vietnam is collapsing and members of the South Vietnamese parliament in Saigon are squabbling with each other, they insult each other using epithets and names of the villains in Jin Yong books. Cha is also a savvy businessman, and he grows his publishing business by catering to the middle brow market in Hong Kong with Ming Pao Weekly, a glossy celebrity tabloid. And during the Cultural Revolution, starting in 1966, he establishes Ming Pao Monthly as a rebuke to the historical nihilism and cultural destruction of the extreme Maoists and Red Guards. For the first issue, he very pointedly chooses for the cover this jade disc, symbol of ancient Chinese culture, to indicate that he's preserving Chinese culture intact in order to pass it onwards. Wan Bi Gui Zhao, if you will. And Ming Pao also publishes calligraphy and games of Go analysis, maybe occupying a space a little bit like, I don't know, the London Review of Books or the New Yorker, if they published games of Go instead of cartoons. And this is a natural fit for the Ming Pao newsroom, which is full of refugee intellectuals from the North, the so-called Nanlai Wenren, who came to Hong Kong to escape the communist revolution, but still have contacts and connections back home. Ming Pao also develops a reputation for well-sourced political reporting from inside mainland China, which offers plenty of nonfiction drama and cliffhangers of its own. Who's up, who's down, who's in, who's out? This little advertisement reads, how did Deng Xiaoping gain advantage in this political struggle? And this one says, Xi Zhongxun, the father of Xi Jinping, who was a high official under Mao. Why was he promoted and then purged? And the ad goes on, if you want to find out what's happening behind the scenes in the Communist Party, you'll have to read Ming Pao Monthly. Towards the climax of the Cultural Revolution, on any given day, you might pick up Ming Pao from a newsstand in Hong Kong and read about a deadly factional struggle among the Red Guards surrounding Chairman Mao. And then turn to the fiction pages and read wuxia fiction about a deadly factional struggle within a Kung Fu sect that worships an elderly reclusive master on the mysterious Peach Blossom Island. And then on another page, you might read an editorial by Louis Cha criticizing the Communist Party. And although these editorials are unsigned, you know it's written by him and not other staff because his headlines use this elegant Song Dynasty kaiti calligraphy type font versus the kind of more blocky style of the other headlines. In the pages of Ming Pao, literature often follows life. During the Cultural Revolution, dead bodies, often tied up and badly beaten, start floating down the Pearl River from Guangdong province and washing up on the shores of Hong Kong. And soon, in the fiction pages, similar dead bodies start bobbing in the waters around the strife-torn Peach Blossom Island. Cha's own life is endangered by his political editorials. During this period, Hong Kong's communist underground is active in threatening assassinations of media figures. And the Hong Kong radio host Lam Bun, who has been critical of the party in his broadcasts, is trapped in his car and burned to death by undercover activists. Louis Cha is announced as next on the death list, and he flees to Singapore for a while until it is judged safe to return so that he doesn't meet the same fate as Lam. Louis Cha's prominence as a journalist, an editorial writer, a fiction author, and as a media executive also earned him an influential audience among political figures. In 1973, he travels to Taiwan, where Chiang Kai-shek and his son and heir, as you all know, Jiang Jingguo, retreated after losing the Civil War. And when Louis Cha is in Taiwan, he meets with Jiang Jingguo, and I think by this time, Chiang Kai-shek is probably too ill to meet. And with Jiang Jingguo, he discusses politics and literature. And then he writes about his experience and his thoughts in Taiwan in Ming Pao, serializing his writings first in newspaper installments and then magazines, and eventually compiling them into a book, just like his novels. Now, at this time, Jin Yong's novels are not officially available for sale in Taiwan. Ironically, although Louis Cha lost his father to communist repression, like many intellectuals, he had some left-wing affiliations in Hong Kong in the 1950s. And in Taiwan, his works were banned as communist bandit fiction, gongfei xiaoshuo. And Jiang Jingguo, after meeting with Cha, agrees to allow the distribution of his books on one condition, and that is that the title of the condor shooting heroes must be changed to the heroes of the desert steppe. Now, why is there this condition? The story behind it tells us something about politics, literature, and media history in Chinese culture. The story goes back to the Civil War between the nationalists and Mao's communists. After the Japanese defeat in 1945, Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek, under pressure from the US and other allied powers, met to negotiate a peace treaty, hosting each other in Chongqing. And at that time, for the US ambassador and the foreign media, Mao made a big show of negotiating, even though both sides believed that the fighting would probably inevitably resume. But in the local Chinese press, Mao published a poem that caused a sensation. And it stated in rather immodest terms his ambition to rule all of China. Mao wrote, "The ancient emperors Qin Shi Huang and Han Wudi were lacking in literary grace, and Tang Taizong and Song Taizu had little poetry in their souls. And Genghis Khan only knew how to shoot condors with his bow and arrow. But for truly great men, look to our modern age." Now, this poetic insult left a psychic scar on the Jiang family as they went on to lose the Civil War, and Mao achieved his ambition to rule China. And so shooting condors in the title had to be changed. And only then was the novel allowed to be distributed here in Taiwan. Louis Cha's other prominent political admirer was Deng Xiaoping, who rose to power after Mao's death. In 1981, with the end of Hong Kong's colonial lease coming up on the horizon, Deng invited Louis Cha up to Beijing. And Cha was one of the first high-profile public figures from Hong Kong to go. When they met, Deng claimed that he was a big fan of Cha's books, which were still banned in China, but which he got by a special delivery from Hong Kong. And Cha later said that Deng had the bearing, the fenggu, of one of the heroes from one of his novels. And soon Deng agreed to lift the ban on Cha's novels in mainland China, which made him a literary icon to 1 billion people in China as well. And this is about the point where people who admired Cha's earlier political stances become a bit skeptical of him. Because it's one thing to take this meeting in Beijing and to get your Kung Fu novels distributed. But from a journalistic perspective, it really starts to look like a conflict of interest when you put the meeting on the cover of your own influential magazine and then put a full record of the talk inside, maybe without some of the critical context you might expect from a journalistic effort to be impartial. But Cha makes no apologies as he joins the Hong Kong Basic Law Drafting Committee and the handover approaches, and he stakes out rather conservative positions on issues of democratic representation and universal suffrage. He does resign from the Basic Law Committee after the crackdown in Beijing in 1989 and gives a television interview about it, where he says that he feels the crackdown was outrageous, but perhaps the protesters were a bit too idealistic. And in the long term, he really makes his peace with the authorities in Beijing. Perhaps reasoning that this is not the same Communist Party that killed his father, but some generations have passed. And perhaps thinking that there's no other credible institution to make China a strong and respected nation that properly reflects its ancient glories. And this is a classic conflict that Cha's ancestors would have recognized. Dangguan bu dangguan, do you go into service or do you stay away? And that's consistent with the traditional Chinese model of a literary man who is a patriot and who wants to be of service to the state and to the imperial throne, however imperfect the emperor might be. When I went to interview Cha a few years before he died, I knew that his health was frail and that this might be his last interview. And so I brought piles of books and printouts to see what might interest or stimulate him or spark a conversation. And instead of talking to me at first, he immediately picked up and started reading a book about his family lineage, the Chas, detailing centuries of service to the imperial throne going back generations. And afterwards, when I had a chance to give it a close read myself, I realized that this book is another example of how today's Communist Party, like any good, well-rounded leadership, takes a healthy interest in cultural affairs. This book is now about 15 years old, and it was put together by the Zhejiang Province Cultural Guidance Committee, chaired by the General Secretary of the Zhejiang Communist Party at the time, Xi Jinping. And Xi has maintained an interest in both Jin Yong's fiction and in his home province. A few years back, Xi took a tour of the real-life Peach Blossom Island, which is off the coast of Zhejiang province. And in a statement to official state media, he praised Jin Yong's novels for their evocative descriptions of the Peach Blossom Island. And I can only assume that he meant that in a literal way and not as a reference to the bloody factional struggles that inflicted so much suffering on Xi's father and his family and had a fictional echo in the sect battles on the Peach Blossom Island that ended with corpses bobbing in the surrounding waters. But it does, in any case, exemplify how in the Chinese tradition, the distance between history and fiction is about as far as the distance between literature and politics, which is to say, not very far at all. One of the enduring mysteries about Jin Yong's novels is how they can be so vastly popular in East Asia and relatively unknown in the West. A few years ago, a new translation came out for the first Condor's book, and I would commend it for all of you who might prefer to read it in English. A good translation, like a good compromise, it leaves everyone a little dissatisfied. Some readers of the original books love soaking in all the traditional culture that they contain. And at Yale, some of the history professors have complained that when we get students from China, they know all of their imperial history from Jin Yong books, even the fictional parts. But if in the translation you take too much time to explain every detail of the traditional culture with footnotes and asides, it really slows the action down. On the other hand, if you cut out too much of the historical background, you lose that scaffolding, the plot starts to feel weak and wobbly, and you can't really grasp the epic stakes at play. And I certainly don't envy the challenge of any translator in trying to make Jin Yong accessible to the West. But Anna Holmwood and her team of collaborators, I think, have done a good job as any finding that balance. There's also a translation by Graham Earnshaw and John Minford, if you go and look for those books. And there are some versions in French, and I believe that there may be more English translations coming out in the future. Now, from our point of view as translators, interpreters of China, China watchers, scholars, journalists, and I see many distinguished interpreters, thinkers about China and China watching in the room here tonight. I thought we could think about a little bit about how, from a craft perspective, we might evoke some of that richness and historical resonance in our own work, even in a small way. Towards the end of my own article, I wrote that Condors, written in the late 50s, captures the trauma of the communist takeover through the ancestral memory of nomad invasions from the north. Its characters face the same challenges as Cha's generation, deciding whether to join the new northern regime or flee to the south as a patriotic refugee, and the anguish of losing the rivers and mountains of one's ancestral land. Now, that line was carefully chosen. The story goes that after the Chongqing peace agreement fell apart and the civil war resumed, and Chiang Kai-shek and his son Jiang Jingguo fled mainland China for this island of Taiwan, they still kept a few military outposts on rocky outcroppings facing the communist mainland, hoping to someday return. I'm sure some of you have been there. I went a few years ago and actually ran the Jinmen half marathon and had the Gaoliangzhou. And on the walls of the concrete bunkers, underneath the barbed wire and the vegetation, they ordered the display of these four characters: return my rivers and mountains, return my native land. And they did it not only in the words of the martyr general Yue Fei, but also in his original calligraphy as well. And to my mind, that's a testament, in the case of China especially, to the words of William Faulkner, the American novelist, who wrote that the past is never dead, it's not even past. Thank you.
Great.
turn my rivers and mountains. The past is never past.
I don't think the mic's on. You might need to project. Ah, follow on.
Questions? Suji. Would you like the question? First question?
Which novel of Jin Yong's is your favorite? And why?
Ah, 压力很大. This is an awkward moment to admit that I have not read every single page of every single Jin Yong book. But Xue Shanfei, who is very interesting because of the multiple perspectives. And a lot of people like Tianlong Babu. That's a favorite. I found that I started to get interested in it partially because I saw Jet Li in Xiaoao Jianghu. And I think Xiaoao Jianghu, Jin Yong did tell me that Hong Jiaozhu was kind of a parallel to the party. And so, hard to choose. Let's say Tianlong Babu, why not? But actually, people have come up to me and asked me,你觉得黄药是真的做什么事? I was like, I don't know. I'm sorry. I'm not at that level of a fan. I wish I could tell you the answer to the question, but I know there are more serious fans in the audience, so I'll defer to them for those kind of detailed questions.
Lawyers often answer question with a question. What is your favorite? No answer. A very good advisor. Any other questions?
How did you get into the world of Jin Yong yourself?
I used to work in media in Hong Kong. And in order to practice my Chinese, I would buy Ming Pao every day. And I would go through Ming Pao with a dictionary. And Ming Pao, for many years, had a reputation of having a best quality language of any of the newspapers published in Hong Kong. And I don't know if anyone here grew up in Hong Kong, but I've heard that parents would often buy Ming Pao and make their children read it at breakfast to improve their Chinese language ability. And I thought, if it's good enough for a Hong Kong 10-year-old, it's good enough for me at the age of 20, whatever. And so I started reading Ming Pao, and then a friend in Hong Kong told me, did you know that Ming Pao was founded by this interesting character who also wrote these novels? And if you like the Chinese language in Ming Pao, you might enjoy the Chinese language and culture in the novels. And so I started reading. I thought, oh my God, this is the most interesting person ever. And yet no one in the West seems to know who he is. He has a stature in the Chinese language world like J.R.R. Tolkien or another one of these really important authors. But imagine if J.R.R. Tolkien had founded the New York Times or something like that. And I thought this would be an interesting character and a personality. Reading Jin Yong's books, I realized that I could see why they're difficult to translate into English. And I thought it might be better to use a more shorter form, but still long form, a literary magazine like The New Yorker, to try and introduce him to readers in a more digestible way. Because they can be hard to get into. And as I said in the translation, it's not always obvious why he's such a popular writer in Chinese. And so that's how I started reading, and I was fortunate to be able to meet him while he was still alive and able to give an interview, although it did turn out to be the last interview of his life.
Other questions?
Do you know why Jin Yong is relevant to Taiwan? It's a question for the audience.
I was going to ask, how would Jin Yong play out the China, Taiwan?
Yes, so I want to step carefully here. Just take since I am not from China or Taiwan, and So Jin Yong was of a traditional frame of mind, or what you would call very normal among that generation. And in his record of 在台所见所闻所思, after his meeting with Zhang Jingguo and his trip to Taiwan, he serialized and then published in a book some of his thoughts. And the Cha family was very large. He had relatives who stayed in China and were in the north. And he had, I think, also a sibling who was living here in Taiwan. And so he had a broad perspective on it. And he had the view that Taiwan is a part of China, but it should be a more democratic and tolerant China. That was his view. And I think he writes that right at the beginning of his 在台所见所闻所思. The relevance in terms of his fiction is a more interesting question, because it's something that comes up in the Southern Song Dynasty context. And actually, at the very beginning of the Condor's book, the two guys who start the novel, who get into the sparring fight, Yang Tiexian and Guo Xiaotian, they're talking to each other, and then they meet the Buddhist monk, Qiu Chuji, and they're saying, 我们中国人那么多，我们怎么不可以对抗这些关外的 we're so many, numerous, us Chinese. How is it possible that there are so many of us and so few of the invaders, and yet we cannot band together to resist them and to reclaim our native land? And I'm certainly not a military historian or strategist of any kind, but it would be my thinking that maybe when you are a large empire on a large continent, you think a certain way about defense, and you think in a way that does not emphasize mobility and the ability to have striking power with mobility combined together. So you lack that. And the nomads coming from the north are on horseback, and they have a lot of striking power. And also they're often doing things that are unexpected from the Chinese point of view. It can be hard to predict. And someone in the audience might correct me, but I think the trebuchet at the Battle of Xiangyang was a novel military technology that helped the Mongols a lot. And this is where Guo Jing gets into trouble, right? Someone will have to remind me this plot of the novel. But so this is always an undercurrent in the Jin Yong novels. Why is it that we as a large empire have so much trouble defending against these smaller armed groups? And without getting out of my lane and saying too much about Taiwan, I have heard that the new buzzword here is asymmetric warfare. Does that sounds right to people? And one of the other, so thinking asymmetrically, thinking strategy, and not getting too hung up on having a stationary and highly symbolic base. And so there's a long history in China, not just of nomadic invasions, but also peasant rural rebellions. Every 200 or 300 years in Chinese history, there's something that just makes you go, oh God, this is why we can't have nice things. The nomads pour through the Great Wall, and the capital goes up in flames, and the lamenting of the women and so on. And that's every century or two, there's something like that. And often the problem is they get fixated on the symbolism of having a capital and not being mobile. And you get, and this, by the way, happens to the nomad tribes infamously as well. You can't rule a nation on horseback, goes the old expression. And so the people who are originally mobile and have a lot of striking force, they come and they rule China for a few generations, and they take on what some would call the bad habits of the people they conquered. And this was a huge problem for the Manchus. The last dynasty, the Qing dynasty, the Manchu emperors are always complaining that the ethnic Manchus are not good at horseback riding, they're not good at archery. And it actually takes an ethnic Chinese, Zheng Guofan, who during the Taiping Rebellion, who comes up with sort of a new type of warfare model. And just to finish a note on that, the Taiping Qianguo, the Taiping Rebellion, was a very, very successful rural insurgency arguably until they became fixated on protecting the capital of Nanjing, which became their Tianjin, their heavenly capital. And once they put all of their eggs in the basket of defending that capital and lost their mobility, I'm not a military expert, but my understanding is that that was a bad move for them, and it ended up pinning them in place. And so I would simply end on that notion about asymmetric warfare and being smart against a much larger adversary.
Comments, questions?
I'm just wondering, do you think the difficulty for non-Chinese readers to really read and understand and appreciate how important the Jin Yong novels are to, say, a Chinese? Do you think this difference or this, this huge, sort of huge gap in terms of cultural understanding is overcomable? What I'm saying is that for a foreign person who does not have a Chinese heritage, I think it's it may be extremely difficult. I mean, I don't know. I have Chinese heritage, but it seems that it is extremely, it could be extremely difficult for a person without a Chinese heritage to read and really understand and appreciate why everything in the Jin Yong novels are so important, and it brings such an echo in a person with a Chinese heritage. And do you think this sort of like how do you say a non-Chinese person could ever overcome that, or come to appreciate what a Chinese person really feels about? I mean, and that's really interesting to me, because as you say, I can see, like, no matter how well Jin Yong novels are translated, there's just so many footnotes embedded in every concept and perhaps in every relationship.
Yeah.
And the smallest gestures of, what a monk does, what this person does, what that person does. And that is really difficult for a person to read Jin Yong novels in the translation to fully understand and fully grasp why the Chinese people are like so into that it's so captivating in a way to a Chinese person that perhaps a non-Chinese person becomes very difficult for them to really feel that echo.
Yeah. That's an excellent question, and it's one that I've struggled with a lot, and it's one that I wrote about in the piece, and it's one that I tore my hair out thinking as I walked the streets of Manhattan, going from editor to editor, saying, no, really, you got to believe me, this is going to be big. This, and when we did finally get the piece published, I was gratified to see that it really lit up Twitter. People who are from the Chinese language community and had read the books as a child but were active on English language Twitter were tweeting, finally, someone has tried to explain it in a way that's digestible for Guaylos, for Lawai.
The article is on each of your tables. Can I just touch on this?
Take a crack at it, for sure.
Last week, I was having dinner with an active ROC general. I invited him to come tonight, but he was busy. He is a fighting, hands-on general. And the conversation is actually the opposite. We had a discussion about the topic. Of course, many people who are military families grew up with this as part of their childhood regular diet. And we began talking about, I asked him, I said, in Chinese history, from Han Dynasty forward, all the way through Song and Ming, you have, here's an example, you have 1 million Mongols destroying over 300 years a dynasty with over 100 million people, more resources, etc. How can that happen? This general is staring at me and he says, I have no answers from Jin Yong. So actually, the cultural affinity and proximity is a blind spot. And we discussed some of the things that they said, and we also discussed many other historical examples of smaller combatants overcoming hugely overwhelming opponents. Naturally, this general is extremely interested in continuing this conversation. We'll have the interview and send it again. This is the question for Taiwan.
Yeah, well, I was just gonna say, in terms of the Western readers, it's a challenge. Certainly, if you didn't grow up reading Three Kingdoms, Sangguo, Shuihu, that sort of thing, I would recommend this book to people. And I recently asked my wife, who is not of any, she's not of any Asian or Chinese cultural heritage, but she's reading Sangguo at the moment with her book club. And she asked, is it always this violent? Are people's heads always being cut off? And it's certainly true that when you read a book, and those of you who pick up the translation of Condors, the first time someone pulls a severed head out of a bag, you might have a little reaction and think, wow, how many more of these to come? And the answer is a lot. And that is not really normalized. And so people come to the books without this prior sense of the culture. And so there's a challenge there. And I like to believe that many of the themes are universal. Love, loyalty, betrayal, treason. On the other hand, it's very hard to understand if you don't have many dynasties of history in your brain about, oh, we're always fighting the nomads north of the Great Wall. This has been a problem for every dynasty. And, going way, way back, it's what are we going to do about the nomads across the Great Wall who are raiding us and so on. And so if you don't understand that, it's a little bit hard to understand Wan Yan Honglie when he discovers his true parentage and his background, or Yang Kang when he discovers that he's actually, because he goes beyond the step, and that sort of clash of loyalties, it takes a lot of footnotes, it takes a lot of explaining. And so you don't get the same instant effect. And if you slow down to explain it all, then you don't have all the exciting action. And even when you translate the exciting action, in English, it's the 5-blossom dragon fist. And it's just, oh my, it really is very clunky to do. And there's many reasons why it's challenging. But, when you read it in Chinese, it really goes along nice and snappy. And when you sort of do all the blossom fist dragon, you don't feel like you're in an actual sort of kung fu fight. And so it's hard, but I continue to hope that there will be, I was surprised in hindsight to think that Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon was the wuxia thing by Wang Dulu, I think. Why was that the film that had the breakout potential? Maybe because the plot wasn't as good. Sorry, no offense to any Wang Dulu fans in the audience. And why was it not a Jin Yong story that had the breakout? And so I continue to hope, there's many cultural things that seem confusing that have a lot of purchase. And I continue to hope that a Jin Yong, probably a movie before a novel, will be the thing that breaks through and gets that breakout success in the West.
Let's talk to Michelle Yeoh about that.
Yeah, I'll call her up.
Last question, and then let's close the evening. Anything? Sonia?
In addition to the cultural barrier for Western people to appreciate those very Chinese context sensitive novels, I'm just wondering whether there is also a generational gap. For younger generation, they don't care about the dynasty or the context. They only understand the novel context by movies, by even the game.
Video
A
game,
lot of
yeah,
movies.
yeah.
So that's basically, that's for younger generation. Can they differentiate between Harry Potter's novels and the Jin Yong's novels?
Yes,
And this, I'm just wondering, for example, my daughter never read Jin Yong's novel. So the gap may not be just Western or.
yes.
If I may just add to that, I was just gonna ask, I love your question about how Jin Yong is relevant to Taiwan. But to be honest, I'm not sure how relevant he is anymore, at least now, because I
Yes,
was talking to a friend of mine, it's a surgeon. He told me that he used to use Jin Yong terminology to explain surgery. Like 六脉神剑 collagen. But then he's talking about from about 2 years ago. These medical students don't know what he's talking about.
yes.
And you feel so bad about it. And That's how relevant it is. Yes.
I think we need to.
Yeah, I'll keep it short. I'll just say, 一代不如一代. Anyway, thank you all so much. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Wonderful. I've made a request that you comes that
We will do this completely in Chinese, so they will record it for our and his colleagues, so they can understand.
My Kung Fu isn't good enough for that.
Thank you very much, everyone. I hope you enjoyed. We have more programs coming up, and some is written on the document on the table. We have Andrew Yang pending, who is a former defense minister, talking about dire straits. That's his title. And we also have Bill Reinfeld coming up, who is going to talk about the miracle economy, how Taiwan and the KTV story, how Taiwan transformed itself into what we enjoy today. And several others. We have Mike Chinoy on a variety of topics. Anyway, we'll send notices out to people. We hope you enjoy Nick's amazing presentation.
Thank you.
This
years and years of team at
the club for all their help and support. Thanks so much. And can somebody help us take a photo of the group? Somebody have an iPhone? Here. Just take a shot of the whole room from one side, just so we have a record. Yeah. Thank you. Don't need the food, just the people. Yeah. 谢谢。I have one last thought on this question of the relevance to Taiwan. 816 years ago, a boy was born in remote Mongolia. He was born to a very poor family. And as a child, his father was betrayed and killed. And he and his brother and his mother were put out into the wilderness to survive. His prospects of success were quite limited. And as a part of this scarring childhood, he grew up, and the modern world, when he died, encompassed a landmass larger than Rome and Alexander's empires combined. When he was born, his name was Temujin. You know him as Genghis Khan. And his whole family life is a struggle. And why is he relevant? because much of the known world became part of his family estate. It included Korea and all the way to Europe. Many Chinese, Han Chinese, consider him Chinese because they backdate his birth, right? So they look at him as a Chinese emperor. But one land that was not included in his family estate was this island. So the concept of China to different people depends on your historical reference. But he was the ruler of the greatest land empire. His grandson took Song and all the way to Yunnan. And so modern day China takes on these borders. Whether we are their mountains and rivers, or whether they are our mountains and rivers, or whether they are completely unrelated, we don't know. It is yet to be written. So the relevance, therefore I have no answer, depends on your version, which one you pick. But this man who had a very unpromising childhood, in some ways defined China. Is Taiwan China or not? Hey, everyone is wrestling with that. And what kind of China? Or what kind of society? When Nixon and Mao met, they didn't ask us. Of course, we didn't have a vote at the time, but we do now. And both China and Washington will have to find out how to involve us in the conversation. And that is yet to come. Anyway, I think that Nick's stories about the loyalty, the love, family, patriotism still matter. Thanks for coming tonight.